Well, we've heard from George and Little and their argument against abortion, and now we are hearing the another argument in favor of the moral permissibility of abortion. This is by Margaret Little. Here's a picture of Margaret Little. I chose this particular essay because I think it's a novel argument that you probably have not heard. And part of the point, again, of using abortion is one of the issues we're going to cover, even though you've probably heard it to death, right? In this country, you can't avoid hearing arguments about abortion, but I think often we hear the same arguments over and over, and the two main arguments that you hear tend to sort of talk past each other, right? One is about abortion is murder, the other says women have rights to their bodies, and right, both could actually be true. They're not necessarily actually contradictory, right? Um, and so this particular essay, I think, um, concedes to the opponent of abortion certain premises, right? But nonetheless argues that those premises actually entail that abortion should be permissible, right? So I think it's an interesting argument in that way. Okay, so framing the debate. So as I said, she's going to accept some of the premises that some opponents of abortion um, use, and so she is not disputing the claim that fetuses are human or that they have worth and dignity, um, right? She's not saying, "Oh, this is just a lump of tissue. What's the big deal?" Right? She wants to take that part of her opponent's argument seriously, um, and instead, what she wants to do is argue from the value of that relationship and the value of early life. Um, Take those premises and say, if you believe those premises, you actually should believe that that abortion is morally permissible. So recall the standard argument from George and Little at the very beginning, right? Premise one, abortion is the intentional killing of a person. Premise two, the intentional killing of a person is wrong, therefore abortion is wrong. This is sort of where they started off in their argument, George and Little, before they started to, consider some objections to some of those premises. Um, so she does admit that she, she's she does want to say, right, that it feels like a stretch to call a fertilized egg a person, right? Um, and she wants to say that some of the confusion and some of the disagreement on these arguments has to do with like what is the status of a fetus, right? What category do we put it in, right? So we see a picture of, I think this was, I don't know, it's 6 weeks or something, or it's a few weeks fetus, and it doesn't quite look like a person exactly, right? Um, and she points out, if someone has a miscarriage, um, it can certainly be tragic, and it's it's a hard thing to go through, but we typically don't treat it as equivalent to the death of like an infant or a young child, right? That is a tragedy of another magnitude, um, and she thinks that that's because there is some kind of difference going on here, right? But she says there is a value, right, that we attach to an embryo, and it is different than just any collection of cells. Um, and so she thinks we just don't, our conceptual scheme has sort of a gap in it. It's missing the appropriate category for this form of early life. Um, they're potential persons, right? That makes them more valuable than a clump of hair, right? Um, but they're not full persons, right? And in this, she actually disagrees with Lee and George, right? They argue that they are fetuses are persons. She wants to say no, there's something in between, right? Um, and so she says the problem is since we have this sort of gap in our conceptual scheme, we don't really have the right concept for this kind of life. It's real easy to slip into applying personhood, but that's not. She thinks that's not really quite appropriate, right? And if it were, then a miscarriage would be as huge a tragedy as right, a baby dying, right? And she thinks no, there's a difference there. Okay, so what is this category, right? So let's imagine for a moment that person is a biological category, right? We're talking about fetuses as persons, and George and Lee talked a lot about persons, right? Remember, you'll recall they considered the view that personhood comes from self-consciousness, stuff like that. So she's in this world. This concept is debated, right? What does make something a person? Um, well, if it's a biological category, then it's pretty clear that the fetus is probably a person, right? It is sort of the same biological entity that becomes a person, right? And that's sort of George and Lee's point. Um, but it is also generally accepted that person is a moral category, right? That's the point of the difference between human being and person, is that persons have moral status. They are worthy of praise and blame, right? Um, and moral status, she claims, does not derive solely from biology, right? It's something else. She doesn't really quite defend that claim. I think it's probably a commonly accepted claim, but maybe you could push back on that, right? There could be a naturalistic account of morality, moral status, um, but that's a tough one. Okay, so, but even the biological part, right? It does require the help of the mother, and this is something again where she differs from George and Lee. Recall that George and Lee say something like, well, a fetus has a developmental trajectory, and as so long as it's not interfered with, it will become a person, right? Well, a mother does a lot more, right, than not interfere with the fetus, is Little is pointing out. Um, my wife had a baby a couple of years ago, and yeah, there's a lot of vitamins you have to take, right? Here's the image here is the 30-day pregnancy plan workout, right? There's like a lot that has to go on, right? So the fetus is just not going to become a person unless the mother is pretty actively involved, says Little. Um, and it requires the agency of the mother to right to care for the pregnancy, make sure it develops correctly. Again, we've got this moral relationship, right? These this normativity, right? This should of what you should do, what should your be relationship with the fetus, and so there is a even early on, it's not just a fetus developing on its own, housed by the mother. There's this morally weighted relationship between the mother and the child that's in existence very very early on. Um, so if she's convinced you of that, right? Um, what are these moral overtones, right? And does this mean that the fetus has the moral status of a full person, or again, is it something else? Is it some other category? So I took this quote because I think it's a good quote, right? So she says, such biological potential, right? The potential for personhood in the biological sense. And of course, there's more to personhood, she claims, than just the biological. But such biological potential marks out early human life, especially respect-worthy, which is why we should try to avoid conception where children are not what is sought after, right? So there is some sort of moral um, internal. We have an instinct that yeah, you shouldn't just go have kids, right? You shouldn't just go get pregnant if you're not planning to have kids, right? That's why we use contraception and stuff. And then in parentheses, or again, right? This special potential marks out why we don't think we should pack up human embryos on the wall for art or provide them to children to dissect at school if the fertilized chicken eggs are too pricey. Um, to say that such life is respect worthy, right? So to say there is respect worthiness there is not the same thing as saying that we have to defer to fetuses as persons. And this photo is from uh, the Nirvana in Utero, the back cover. So Kurt Cobain was an artist too, and this he used a lot. These aren't real fetuses in his art, but he used a lot of that imagery. I think because he was aware of that it is a bit jarring, right? Because of what Little is saying here, right? It does feel wrong, right? To, as she says, tack a fetus up on the wall as art, and he was sort of using that again, that instinct, that intuition we have that there's something special about a fetus, and you don't just right, yeah, just throw it on a canvas or whatever. So Little, she's going to come back and try to determine this precise nature of this moral status. She's going to have a lot to say about it, but she wants to say a few things about sort of what's not going on in abortion. So she has to address this issue of like, is abortion murder, right? Um, Even though her argument is different, right? But nonetheless, it's she has to defend against it, and so she this sort of has in the background, we're assuming we remember this Thompson argument, right, where the violinist has captured you and they've hooked, or I'm sorry, the music fans have captured you and hooked you up to this ailing violinist, and they've got you circulating his blood. And the question is, can you unhook yourself? It seems like, well, sure. But then the question is abortion like that, just unhooking yourself? That's what Thompson said. Little has another approach to it, and she says, uh, here's the difference between a difference between abortion and killing. When you kill someone, you're interfering with the trajectory of their life, right? So they had plans, they were going to go to work, they probably wanted to, buy a house, get married, raise their kids, right? They had a trajectory, and you went in, you cut it short, right? You knocked it down. If you hadn't done that, they would have been fine, probably, right? Maybe something terrible unexpected could have happened, but like they were on a path, right? And you totally messed that up by killing them. The fetus is pretty different. She says, it comes into existence on a downward trajectory, right? If not for the mother, right, that fetus is not going to survive very long, right? So you are from the beginning preventing, if anything, this fetus from death, right? So that's very different from killing, right? Or she thinks it is. Um, Again, when you kill, you jump in there and you mess up somebody's life that was going in a totally different direction. But when you withhold aid from a fetus, um, you were the only thing that was keeping it up in the first place, right? Okay, so objection, right? She says, an opponent might say, well, you're the one that created the being, right? You had sex, you got pregnant, um, and so you brought it into existence on a downward trajectory. So that the fact that it's in that situation is your fault, so you are responsible. Um, And her response is, well, okay, yeah, even if I did bring them into existence, but bringing something into existence is not a harm, right? Existing is better than not existing, right? So maybe it popped into existence on a downward trajectory and then pops back out, but like they're not worse off than they were. They didn't exist at all, right? So they existed for a minute. That's better. So or it's either better, right? Maybe it was a temporary benefit, or worst case is just sort of neutral. It's just sort of a wash, right? Um, the the existence and the non-existence were comparable. Anyways, that's her claim. The next essay you're going to read is actually argues that bringing someone to existence is always a harm, right? So that would be a sort of directly in contradiction to her claim here. She sort of assumes it, right? Well, bringing someone to an existence, that's not harmful, right? But that is questionable. It'll turn out. Okay, but back to her argument. So she says, yeah, abortion is different from murder, right? You're not interfering with someone's life. You're sort of like it's kind of leaning on you, keeping out of death, and you're just sort of like stepping aside. Um, but she does claim again that there is value in early life. There's this moral weight, so as yet undefined, right? She's trying to sort of create the appropriate category that our conceptual scheme doesn't have. And it doesn't seem to be a killing issue, according to her. So what is it? Okay, so the gestational relationship. So this is what she wants to get into, right? Um, this relationship between the mother and the child. How do we define it? It's a serious relationship. So pregnancy can be very incredibly taxing, right? Besides the morning sickness and the aching back, um, often there's mental health issues. There's all kinds of social costs, right? You can lose your job, um, family relations, depending on the situation, whether your parents or your husband or significant other, or right, depending on how you feel about the pregnancy, right? They can not want to help you or be angry at you. Um, People often stay in abusive relationships once they get pregnant, right? Because they think they have to. So there's lots and lots of. Uh, it's very taxing. Right? Um, and there's another very important personal significance. You literally have another being like inside you, living on in you and off you for 9 months. And that's just the beginning, right? After the birth, now you're a mother and you've got all the responsibilities and life changes that brings, right? It's a lot. Um, so typically when someone has an abortion, right, the reason is they don't want that whole package of stuff that's like a big package. They don't want to do that right now, right? Um, and she claims even if you have the child and give it up for adoption, it's kind of too late. You become a mother, right? The change has happened. And some people just don't want to go through that. They can't. They're not equipped to do it at the moment. So here's a little quote from her. She says, deciding whether to continue a pregnancy isn't like being asked to write a check for charity, however large, right? It's just not something then you can sort of add up in a cost benefit analysis. It's it's a change in life. It's a complete change to your life. She says it's an enormous undertaking that has reverberations for an entire lifetime, right? Um, and this is, you may recall, George and Little, right? They at the very end of their article, they threw in a couple extra arguments. One was a little utilitarian argument that says, well, what's like the most harm and the most benefit, right? Um, if you have a kid and then give it up for adoption, yeah, that's some harm. Like being pregnant, they recognize that yeah, there's a lot involved in that and that it's taxing, but you give it up for adoption, and they say, but then on the other hand, murdering the baby, or like according to them, right, or killing it, that's a lot of harm, right? And she says it's not even in the world of cost benefit analysis or utilitarian calculus, right? She says it's an entire sort of life change, and you can't compare it to like, all right, how big a check do I have to write with my body to like, right, to then be able to hand off this fetus and morally, she says it can't be thought of in those terms, right? Okay, now she gets into some sort of analogies that she thinks will sort of point out the gravity of this relationship, right? Of this gestational relationship, and why uh, it's something that has to be up to the mother. Okay, so she says, imagine that a man has proposed to you, right? And he's very rich, and your family's in some serious financial problems, right? He could solve all of that for you and your family. It would create a lot of happiness for a lot of people that you love. Um, let's suppose also he's actually a very kind person, and you could probably even right come to love him. Um, she says, given that situation, right, are you morally required to marry this guy? And she thinks the intuition that everyone will say was no, no. It doesn't matter how much benefit it's going to cause for you and your family and whoever. Um, there's no requirement for you to marry someone, right? Um, we think that's up to us. Um, now, how would people think about it in maybe the Middle Ages? It might be different, right? But definitely contemporary Americans, we think that here's something that's up to you, who you decide to marry, right? Um, right. And she says, even if, like, imagine that whole situation, your family's in financial trouble, blah, 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 and maybe the circumstances were such that you were morally required to write a very big check to save them. Um, marriage is still not equivalent, right? Even if you were on the hook for all that money for whatever reason, you wouldn't be on the hook to marry, right? To solve the same problems. She says marriage, totally different thing, always up to you, right? No matter what, again, costs and benefits, the utilitarian calculus, right? Another analogy says, okay, let's imagine another situation just to drive the point home. Um, your country is at war. It's a truly evil enemy, right? It's this is life and death for you and all your nation, right? It's whatever. It's World War II. You're invaded by the Nazis, that kind of thing, right? She says, uh, what could you do to help the war effort? And you're asked to provide sex to the soldiers to boost their morale. And let's suppose, for argument, that actually it would boost their morale just enough for them to win the war, prevent all this suffering. She says, are you morally required to do this? Again, she thinks your instinct, your intuition would be like, no, no, it's always up to you who you have sex with, right? There's no sort of moral situation like that that could force you uh, to enter into that sort of relationship, right? Like marriage, it's kind of a special sort of relationship, and it's always up to you. Um, so she thinks when people, right? So there's something like this to the argument you frequently hear, which is like abortion is the thing about it, is abortion is an issue of a woman's rights over her own body. She says, in this sense, that makes sense, right? Because you do have this certain autonomy when entering into these very specific kinds of relationships. Um, is you have a right to determine your own selfhood, and that allows absolute choice when it comes into entering into certain types of relationships, motherhood, is one of those sorts of relationships, along with sex, marriage. Okay, so if you believe this so far, right, then uh, motherhood, it seems, has as much claim as any of these other relationships to being intimate, personal, valuable, life transforming, right? At least, certainly probably more so than sex and marriage, right? Um, so she's saying, as a proponent of the moral permissibility of abortion, she's not at all saying the fetus has no value, right? She's saying quite the opposite. It's an essential sort of member of an incredibly valuable, important, life changing relationship, right? And such relationships should not be entered into casually and without careful thought. So this does mean that there can be bad reasons to have an abortion, right? Um, and she calls these indecent, right? Like, so if she thinks the reason to have an abortion is this, if for some reason you are not prepared or you can't enter into this relationship, right? This motherhood gestational relationship. But if it was just sort of a casual thing, like I think she says to fit into a party dress, right? Something like that. Okay, that's not really respecting the value of what's going on here, and that would be sort of an indecent reason to have an abortion. She thinks there could probably be parallel reasons not to marry someone, right? Um, if you love them terribly, but then they sort of lost some of their money or something, right? You could imagine similarly indecent reasons not to marry someone again because of the value of those sorts of relationships. Okay, she's going to consider some objections. So here's one objection. Well, if the motherhood relation is so valuable, then shouldn't people be extremely careful when they engage in sex, right? And then if they become pregnant, well, right, you should have thought about that, right? This is a very important kind of relationship, right? And you weren't careful, so now you're on the hook for the consequences. She says, well, her response is that there is something right about the objection, right? We shouldn't callously disregard the value of procreation. We should be thinking about these sort of things. That's why we use contraception. Um, but she says, okay, so, but if a pregnancy does result for whatever reason, um, is this like, why are you on the hook for the consequences? Is this supposed to be the punishment, right, for engaging in sex carelessly, bringing to term and raising a child? It doesn't seem like a proportional response. It doesn't even really seem to have much to do with the nature of the mistake that was made, right, of the error. And it's certainly not fair to the child. It doesn't seem fair to anyone. So, you know, again, while it's correct that, yeah, the potential procreative, right, powers of sex should be respected, um, but when they're not, and and there's a conception, it's not, the appropriate punishment isn't to have a baby, right? That's doing nobody any good. All right. So last slide. So respect for procreation. So she says when a woman is deciding whether to continue a pregnancy, again, it's typically what they're thinking about is the considerations of whether they're capable of providing the kind of care that the relationship calls for. It's an intense relationship, right? And they're asking, can I do this relationship justice? Uh, this is a different question than the issue of whether the child's life would be worth living under non-optimal circumstances. So maybe you're very young, right, and you wouldn't have the money to really care for this child, and it would suffer in certain ways. And somebody might ask, oh, well, then maybe you shouldn't have the child because that life wouldn't be worth living. That's a complicated question that we'll get into in more abstract terms in the next essay. Um, but she's saying that's not what I'm talking about here. She said what I'm talking about is like giving the respect and care to the motherhood relationship that is. Um, so she's saying to take this decision out of the mother's hands once the life has started, right? Legislatively or whatever, is to just completely misunderstand the situation. Um, the mother is the only person suited, right, to make that decision, right? She's the member of the relationship, um, and so no one else even has, right, the sort of the moral weight or the right stance or position to be able to decide that sort of thing. So it has to be up to the mother. They're the ones, right? that are going to do the job. Okay, so that is it for abortion. We had a little against abortion argument, a little for abortion argument. And then in the next lecture, we're going to talk about, it's a fun little article that argues that bringing someone to an existence is always a harm, and so you should never have kids ever.